Rachel sat hunched over her kitchen table, the glow of a single lamp spilling across stacks of unopened bills and a cracked Bible that she had inherited from her grandmother. The Bible had always been there, always present on a shelf or beside her bed, but she had never seen it as more than a relic of Sunday sermons. Tonight, though, her hands lingered on its worn leather cover as if it held a secret she had overlooked for years. Life had cornered her, rent overdue, her job barely covering groceries, and her relationships fraying under the weight of her constant exhaustion. She felt trapped in an endless cycle, the same day repeated with no glimpse of change. Scrolling numbly on her phone, she stumbled across an article headline that stopped her cold. Florence Scovel Shinn's Hidden Bible Codes That Unlock Your Destiny. At first she laughed softly to herself, thinking it sounded too mystical, too grandiose. But something about the phrase hidden Bible codes pulled at her like a thread she couldn't resist tugging. She clicked, and soon she was reading words that felt like they had been written directly for her weary soul. Florence Scovel Shinn, an artist-turned-metaphysical teacher in the early 20th century, had taught that the Bible was not just a book of history or morality, but a coded map for unlocking divine abundance and destiny. Rachel read about affirmations drawn directly from Scripture, about words being used like keys that could open invisible doors. Florence had called them hidden codes, not because they were concealed from view, but because people had stopped seeing their power. Rachel's heart raced as she devoured sentence after sentence. Could it really be true that the words she had skimmed over her entire life were actually laws, waiting to be activated? The idea seemed almost ridiculous, and yet it awakened something inside her. She remembered being a child, hearing her grandmother read aloud, "Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and ye shall find." Back then, the words had sounded like promises written in stone, but adulthood had smothered that certainty with disappointment. Now, Florence's teachings whispered, maybe those promises had never expired. Maybe Rachel had been living as if the vault were locked, when in fact the key had been in her mouth the whole time. She ordered the game of life and how to play it online, and when the book arrived days later, she tore through its pages in one sleepless night. Florence's words cut through her doubt with startling clarity. Your word is your wand. The invisible forces around you are shaped by the commands you speak with faith. Rachel closed the book at dawn, her fingers trembling. Her mind felt as though a door had opened in a dark room, letting in light she hadn't known existed. That morning, instead of stumbling out of bed defeated, she tried something new. Standing in front of her cracked bathroom mirror, she whispered the first code she had chosen. I now receive all that belongs to me by divine right. Her voice cracked at first, unsure, almost embarrassed. It felt strange, even silly, to say words like that aloud when her fridge was nearly empty and her checking account held only $37. But she remembered Florence's insistence. Faith wasn't about evidence, it was about planting the seed before seeing the tree. Rachel wrote the phrase on sticky notes, pressing one to her fridge, another to her laptop, and one in her purse. At work, she caught herself repeating it under her breath while typing endless reports. Each time, the fear of bills or overdue rent tried to claw its way back into her chest. She whispered the code again, like casting a spell to push the darkness away. Later that week, she pulled the Bible from her shelf and began reading it with new eyes. When she came across, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," she paused. For years it had been a phrase she recited without thought, like a lullaby. Now she saw it differently. It wasn't a comforting metaphor. It was a declaration, a code that commanded lack to disappear from her life. She whispered it out loud, feeling a flicker of strength. I shall not want. My needs are already met. As the days passed, she noticed subtle but undeniable shifts. A small refund check arrived from an insurance company she had long forgotten about. At the grocery store, she found discounts on items she needed most. A neighbor she barely knew knocked on her door to share leftover food from a catering job, enough to last her the week. Rachel's logical mind wanted to dismiss these as coincidences, but her heart whispered otherwise. Something was stirring, aligning, responding. And yet, the biggest change wasn't in her circumstances, it was in her. For the first time in years, Rachel woke up with a sense of anticipation instead of dread. Her mornings began with whispered codes, her evenings ended with gratitude. The old heaviness that once clung to her like a shadow began to lighten. She started catching herself before saying, "I can't afford that," and instead declared, "My supply is unlimited, and it comes to me easily." Still, she wrestled with doubt. Some days, the weight of old habits pulled her down, convincing her that nothing could truly change. On those days, she returned to Florence's words, "You must be careful what you speak, for your words are seeds. Speak only what you desire to harvest." So even when her faith wavered, she chose to plant seeds of abundance instead of lack. One night, sitting at her kitchen table, the same spot where the unopened bills had once mocked her, Rachel opened her grandmother's Bible again. She ran her fingers across the underlined passages, some marked in fading ink from decades ago. She realized her grandmother might have known this secret all along, quietly holding it, living by it, trusting it. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "I now step into my destiny. I am free. I am provided for." She didn't know exactly how her life would change, but something inside her shifted permanently that night. The Bible was no longer a closed book of rules or distant promises. It had become a living code book, one she could finally read. For the first time in years, Rachel went to bed not with fear, but with a spark of faith, and she sensed deep in her bones that this was only the beginning. Rachel sat at her kitchen table long after midnight, the glow of a single lamp illuminating her notebook, the Bible, and the worn little book of Florence Scovel Shinn's writings that she had been reading for days. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the thin pages, underlining certain phrases, circling words that seemed to leap out at her. She felt as though hidden messages were shimmering beneath the surface, as if coded passages were speaking directly to her in whispers only her heart could hear. She had been skeptical at first, of course. Codes hidden in the Bible. It sounded like something out of a movie, not the sort of thing an ordinary woman living in a quiet apartment could stumble upon. Yet the more she read Florence's work, the more undeniable it felt that there was a pattern, a language written not in obvious words but in vibrations and symbols, waiting for the right eyes to notice. The verse she had been stuck on all night was simple: "Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and ye shall find." Everyone had read that line before. Rachel herself had heard it in church countless times growing up. But under Florence's commentary, Rachel realized the code wasn't about begging or pleading for something. It was a command to align the subconscious mind with certainty. To ask meant to claim, to seek meant to expect, to find meant to receive. She whispered the words aloud as she traced them with her fingertip. Ask, seek, find. Then she wrote in her notebook, "When I ask, I command with faith. When I seek, I move with confidence. When I find, I accept with gratitude." It was strange, but the act of writing it down made her feel stronger, as though she had unlocked a door in herself that had been locked for years. The next day, Rachel carried the notebook with her to work. She was a freelance designer, often relying on small gigs to get by, and the stress of unpaid bills and uncertainty weighed heavily on her. Yet something about that morning was different. As she sat down at her desk with her coffee, she whispered the code again: "Ask, seek, find." She decided to test it. Instead of doubting her worth, she imagined herself as already chosen, already blessed with opportunities waiting to unfold. She opened her email, and for the first time in weeks, a potential client had written back. The message was short, almost casual. "Hi, Rachel. I came across your portfolio and would love to discuss a project with you." Her heart skipped. Was this coincidence, or was this the beginning of what Florence had meant by codes hidden in plain sight? For the rest of the week, Rachel continued to test it. Each night she returned to her desk, reading more, decoding more. She saw that verses weren't meant as stories alone, but as spiritual formulas. Let the weak say, "I am strong." That was a code. Speak strength even when you feel powerless. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. Another code. Believe not because you see it, but because belief creates the seeing. She started using these verses as affirmations, not as prayers of desperation, but as precise commands to her subconscious. And slowly, almost invisibly, changes began to unfold. Her energy felt lighter, as if she had shed an invisible weight. People she hadn't spoken to in years reached out unexpectedly. A former client referred her to someone new, and another small project appeared, each one adding to her confidence that something greater was aligning for her. One evening, as rain tapped softly against her window, Rachel closed her eyes and whispered, "Hidden codes, reveal yourselves." She opened her Bible at random, letting the pages fall where they may, and her eyes landed on a line from Isaiah. "Behold, I will do a new thing. Now it shall spring forth. Shall ye not know it?" Her chest tightened, and she read the words again, slower this time. "A new thing, spring forth." It felt like the verse was alive, speaking directly to her. The code was simple but powerful. The promise of renewal, the assurance that what was coming was not just an improvement of the old, but something entirely fresh beyond her imagination. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized that perhaps all along she had been waiting for permission to believe that life could change, that she wasn't doomed to repeat her past struggles forever. The more Rachel leaned into the practice, the more the world around her shifted in subtle yet undeniable ways. She no longer dragged herself through mornings, but woke with anticipation. She began keeping a gratitude list, another layer of Florence's teachings, and each entry made her more aware of the blessings she had been overlooking. Even the way she carried herself changed. Her friends noticed her new calmness, her quiet confidence, though she couldn't quite explain it to them without sounding like she was chasing some mystical secret. It wasn't mystical at all, she thought. It was practical once you understood that the subconscious was like fertile soil, and these codes were seeds. The harvest was inevitable. One night she decided to push the experiment further. She sat with her notebook and wrote down the exact words of Jesus. "It is finished." She circled them 3 times. Florence had explained that these were the most powerful words of command, not of future hope, but of present completion. Rachel closed her eyes and imagined her debts cleared, her business thriving, her health radiant, her heart full of love. And instead of wishing, she said aloud with authority, "It is finished." In that moment, she felt something shift inside her, not outside yet, but in the core of her being. The fear of not having enough dissolved, replaced by a certainty that abundance was already hers. It was as if the codes had activated a hidden switch, and once flipped, there was no going back. Over the following days, confirmations arrived like steady waves. A client offered her double her usual rate without her even asking. An old friend invited her to collaborate on a project that aligned perfectly with her talents. The landlord, who had been pressing her about overdue rent, suddenly gave her an extension, almost apologetically. Rachel sat back in awe, realizing that she wasn't just reading about hidden codes anymore. She was living them. And each time she whispered those phrases, each time she claimed the promise instead of doubting it, she felt herself stepping deeper into a destiny that had always been waiting, just beyond the veil of disbelief. Rachel knew then that this was only the beginning. Florence Scovel Shinn hadn't written her words to create another religion or set of rigid rules. She had written them as keys, and Rachel had finally learned how to turn them. The subconscious, once her prison, had become her doorway to freedom. And with each verse, each hidden code revealed, she was walking into a new chapter of her life, one where she wasn't begging the universe for scraps, but commanding her destiny with the authority she had carried all along. Rachel's mornings began to feel different now. The heaviness that once pressed on her chest each time she rolled out of bed seemed to have thinned into air. She wasn't yet swimming in wealth or basking in perfection, but something within her had undeniably shifted. She carried Florence Scovel Shinn's words like talismans in her mind, and every verse she decoded felt like finding a golden key hidden in plain sight. She had started small, testing the waters with simple affirmations, using phrases like ask, seek, find as daily commands. But with each success, her faith grew. The subconscious, Florence wrote, was obedient, like a servant taking instructions without question. Rachel began to understand that what she repeated, what she felt deeply, was programming her unseen world, and that world would soon shape the visible one. The notebook she had begun with now bulged with handwritten codes, scribbles, and symbols. Some pages were covered with circles around Bible verses. Others contained her reflections, sentences like, "I no longer ask with doubt. I command with certainty." The act of writing them each night gave her a sense of ritual, almost sacred. She no longer saw herself as a victim of her circumstances. Instead, she felt like an author rewriting her life in real time. The beauty of it was how natural it began to feel. There was no struggle, no desperate clawing at hope. It was more like aligning herself with a current already flowing in her favor. Her daily test of the codes continued at work. The second week after she began the practice, she faced what normally would have been a stressful situation. A client was late paying, and she had bills piling up. Before, her instinct would have been to panic, to spiral into fear, perhaps to send a desperate email that reeked of frustration. But now she paused. She opened her notebook and whispered the words she had underlined. "Let the weak say, 'I am strong.'" She wrote it down 3 times and closed her eyes. Instead of focusing on lack, she imagined the payment already cleared, her bank account full, her relief flowing like warm light through her chest. With a calmness that surprised even her, she sent a short, professional message to her client. By the end of the day, she received an apology and immediate payment. Rachel stared at the screen, smiling in disbelief, her heart thundering. Was it the code again, or had she just tapped into something she had always ignored? It didn't stop there. The more she tested, the more life seemed to respond. At the grocery store, she had been short on cash, and instead of panicking, she repeated quietly, "It is finished." A moment later, the cashier told her one of her items was discounted unexpectedly, reducing the total just enough to cover it. Another day, while waiting for a bus, she repeated "Seek, and ye shall find," over and over as she looked for new opportunities in her inbox. Minutes later, she received an unexpected email offering her an invitation to a design expo where she could showcase her work. Little things, yes, but they piled up, each confirming what Florence had said. Once the subconscious is trained, the outer world follows. At night, Rachel began combining the codes into her own powerful phrases. She would whisper them like secrets, but with the authority of someone who knew they would be obeyed. One night she closed her eyes and said, "I command abundance into my life now. I command peace into my heart now. I command opportunity into my path now. It is finished." She repeated it with her hand pressed over her heart until she felt a deep warmth spreading through her chest. She didn't know why, but tears came, soft and cleansing. It wasn't sadness, it was the release of years of fear, years of believing she had to earn love, scrape for survival, beg for blessings. For the first time, she felt worthy without conditions. The codes also began reshaping her relationships. Rachel had always been shy, hesitant to speak up, fearful of rejection. But Florence's insights taught her that the subconscious responds not only to affirmations, but also to images of self. If she saw herself as unworthy, life would mirror it back. So Rachel began imagining herself walking with confidence, speaking with ease, attracting kindness. At first it felt fake, but slowly it took root. Her friends noticed she carried herself differently. She wasn't trying harder, she was simply being. She no longer begged for attention. It came naturally. People leaned into her words, drawn by her calm presence. One friend even asked, "What's changed about you? You seem lighter." Rachel smiled, knowing it wasn't magic in the fantastical sense, but it was transformation nonetheless. Her biggest breakthrough came late one Friday night. She had been meditating on the phrase, "Faith is the substance of things hoped for." Florence had explained that this was the ultimate code, teaching that faith was not an abstract idea, but the very material of creation. Rachel tried to grasp it deeply. She sat in silence, repeating, "Faith is substance. My belief is already building my future." As she held the thought, she suddenly saw her life as though it were clay in her hands, malleable, waiting for her to shape it. She realized the mistakes of her past had come from shaping with fear, expecting loss, and speaking lack. But now she had the tools to shape with faith, expecting fullness, commanding abundance. She laughed softly to herself, overwhelmed with the simplicity of it. That weekend, Rachel decided to test the principle in a daring way. She had always dreamed of owning her own design studio, but she had buried that dream under the weight of bills and doubts. This time, she sat down with her notebook and wrote in large letters, "My design studio exists. It is finished." She closed her eyes and visualized the space, the large windows, the plants on the shelves, the hum of creative energy. For once, she didn't feel it was a fantasy. It felt real, almost tangible. She repeated it night after night, letting the subconscious absorb it. A few days later, an acquaintance she hadn't spoken to in months reached out. "Rachel, I've got a small office space I'm not using anymore. It's nothing fancy, but I thought of you. Would you like to see it?" Rachel's hands trembled as she read the message. She went to see the space, a little corner office with exactly the kind of light she had imagined. It wasn't grand, but it was real, and it was hers if she wanted it. She walked through the room in awe, whispering, "It is finished," knowing that the codes had done their work. By then, Rachel no longer doubted. Every verse was no longer just scripture. It was a formula. Every command she whispered was no longer just hope. It was reality in seed form. She realized that Florence Scovel Shinn's hidden codes weren't about superstition or mystery. They were about mastering the subconscious, the unseen engine of her life. And with every test, every whispered command, Rachel felt herself stepping out of the prison of fear into the why, open space of destiny.